In this video, we are going to understand the difference between var, let, and const. In JavaScript, there are multiple ways we can define a variable. We can define it using var, let, and const. So let's go ahead and first try to understand the difference between let and const. So a variable defined with let can be reassigned. What do I mean by that is we can change the value from aria to brand and it is okay to do that. But whenever you're defining the variable using const and you try to change the value of that variable, you cannot do that. If you refresh, you'll see an error saying assignment to constant variable. So we'll go back to let. So that is the first difference between let and const. Now, in terms of scope, try to understand the difference between var, let, and const. So right now we have variable defined using let. If we try to access these two variables by saying user, we will be able to access that because user is defined in global scope. What if we want to say username, press enter, it will throw an error saying username is not defined. Because whenever a variable defined with let is inside a block of code, it creates a scope and we cannot go inside that scope accessing that value. But what will happen if we change let to var? Refresh this, now try to access user, we will be able to access it. We can also access username. So here we got to understand is when a variable is defined using let, it creates a scope inside block. But when a variable is defined using var, it doesn't create a scope inside a block of code. Let's try to do the same thing, but this time we will define it inside a function. So we'll go ahead, define a function called sayHello. Inside that, we'll define a variable using let. We'll call this function and try to access the variable odd number. And we'll see we will not be able to access it. It will throw an error, odd number is not defined. And we know the reason is because whenever a variable is declared inside a function, it creates a scope, so we cannot access them. So let is also function scoped. What if we change let to var? Does it create any kind of difference? Refresh it, try to access the variable, it doesn't. Because var is also function scoped. It means that defining a variable with var inside a function creates a scope. But defining a variable using var inside a block doesn't create a scope. So in terms of scope, the difference between var and let and const is var is only function scoped, but let and const is block and function scoped. It means that var only creates scope inside function, but let and const create scope inside a block as well as a function. So that is another difference between var, let, and const. Let's try to see some use case for these things. What if I want to write a for loop? In that I'll say let I is equal to 0, I less than 5, I plus plus. I'll go ahead and say console.log I. So we have written a for loop. Inside that we have defined a variable I. What if I want to access that variable outside here by saying console.log I and write a message outside just for identifier? Refresh it and here we can see it is throwing a reference error saying I is not defined. It means that the variable defined with let can only be accessed between this block of code. But what will happen if we change let to var? Refresh this code. Now in output we can see 5 outside. It means I can access the variable outside of that for loop. And the reason for that is because var is only function scoped. Var will only create an independent scope when it is inside a function, nowhere else. For loop is not a function, so it will not create a scope. So a word of advice is whenever you're writing for loop, you should always define a variable using let. Otherwise you will be creating a variable that will be accessed globally. So we learned about the difference between let and var and also saw some application of it. Let's move on to the next difference. Before that, I'll go ahead and comment out this code So we see the output that we need to see. So here we have a variable named user with a value of aria. What if we want to create the same variable name, but this time I want a different value and we'll say brand. Refresh it and here we can access the variable user. And the value is brand because whatever comes last will overtake the previous value. Let's try to do the same thing, but this time we'll do it with let. So I'll go ahead and comment this code and here we'll change it to let. Refresh this and here we see an error saying identifier user has already been declared. So the difference between var and let is using var you can create the box with the same name that can contain different values. But using let you cannot create two boxes with same name in same scope. So here all I want to do is to change the value of user from aria to brand. So we can do it like this. So in this way we learnt about what is the difference between var, let and const. In terms of scope, the difference is var is only function scoped. It means var only creates scope when inside a function. But let and const can create scope when it is inside block or a function. We also saw an use case using for loop where when we define the variable using var, it becomes accessible outside of this loop, but when defined using let, we cannot access it outside. And the last difference is multiple boxes with same name can be created in same scope using var. But when you use let, you cannot do that. It will throw an error saying identifier user has already been declared.